Across the vast theaters of the Great Crusade, whispers persisted, quiet at first, but growing louder and louder still as time went on, in the shadowed corners of conquered worlds. It was not the loyal who first called the Emperor divine. No, it was his enemies. Facing annihilation and stripped of their ancient powers, these broken tyrants, mystics, and high priests did not see a warlord or a strategist, but something far grander and older. An angel, a spirit, a demon, or simply God. They prayed to him with names stolen from forgotten tongues. Under blood-red suns, it was their final act of resistance, or perhaps it was reverence, for only a god could have defeated them in their mind. And amongst all those who fought the emperor in his name, one figure above all others did not simply tolerate this belief, but rather he nurtured it. This was Lorgar Aurelian, that the Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion believed the emperor to be a divine being was no longer a matter of debate. What remains uncertain, though, is when his belief took root. Most evidence suggests that it began long before he ever laid eyes on the master of mankind. Even after assuming command of his legion to stamp out all forms of religion, Lorgar held fast to his beliefs. Publicly, he spoke only of the Imperial Truth, the cold, atheistic doctrine that sought to unify mankind under science and reason. But privately, he said nothing to contradict those who revered the emperor as a god. Amongst his many writings of that era, none contained a single word denouncing the belief that the emperor might be more than a mere mortal, but rather a divine being. While he condemned false gods and arcane faiths without hesitation, he remained curiously or perhaps purposefully silent on the divinity of his own father. This silence would break with the creation of a single incendiary text. This would be the Lectitio Divinatus, penned by Lorgar himself. This work laid out the clear and concise terms, along with the logic and language of worship, not as metaphor, not as myth, but rather as truth. And it did more than offer justification, it offered a blueprint. Though the emperor would later be confined to the Golden Throne, it was the Lectitio Divinatus that first laid out the road upon what would become the imperial cult, the faith that would come to dominate the Imperium. But Lorgar did not walk this path alone. Many presume Erebus and Corferon to have been his earliest allies in this belief, and that's likely true. But records point to others as well. Halikgar, once the Legion Master before Lorgar had taken control, appears to have been converted by the Primarch, along with names like Madero Visar and Uston Cho. Once proud iconoclasts, quickly became members of the faithful. Together, these figures helped transform the very soul of the Legion, and later still, the Imperium itself. On the surface, little changed. Black armored warriors from the 17th still fought as before, methodical, unassuming, and relentless. But beneath that facade, something stirred. Lorgar had planted a fire, one that would not be extinguished by mere victory. For the Wordbearers, it was no longer enough to conquer. One had to be made to believe. The measure of success became internal. A campaign would not be won, and if it was, it would be hollow, if it left no mark upon the soul. And inevitably, belief became a ritual. From these flames rose a new institution within the Legion, the chaplaincy. Clad in midnight black armor and bearing the legacy of the old Imperial heralds, these men were not mere officers, they were guides, guardians of belief, as they spoke not only to the vanquished, but to their brothers, forging doctrine through word and deed alike. Executions became ceremonies. Cities died with ritual solemnity, as chaplains scattered ashes across bowed helmets. New words would therefore enter the Legion's lexicon. Words of Colchis, such as apostate, anatheme, creed, and in the darkened corners of the Legion's discourse, another word began to be spoken in hushed tones, as if the utterance itself carried an immeasurable weight. Heresy. What became of Auric was not simply destruction, it was elevation, a calculated liaison written in fire, blood, and brimstone. Auric was an ancient mountain city buried deep within Terra's southern ice-bound waste, one which had endured longer than most of Old Night, as it was cut off from the rest of humanity. its people came to believe themselves singular amongst the shattered remnants of the human race. Their belief was not merely cultural, it was spiritual as well. The Orcians followed the pantheon of death and the life spirit, entities that claimed to have protected them from the horrors that consumed the rest of the world. They did not see themselves as isolated survivors, they saw themselves as the chosen. And then unification came, and with it the Emperor. Records, fragmentary and heavily redacted, suggest that when the Master of Mankind first turned his attention to Auric, he understood that diplomacy would prove futile. This was no fractured warlord, nor collapsing techno-tribe. Auric held conviction, fortified by prophecy and myth, so the Emperor turned to those whose very doctrine was designed to erase such belief, the 17th Legion. At this time, they were still known as the Imperial Heralds, not yet the word-bearers they would eventually become. But even then, their mission was clear: bring the Imperial Truth to all corners of Old Earth and destroy all resistance to its spread. The city was given a choice: submit to unity or be destroyed. The priest kings of Auric did not hesitate. They offered no answer. No messenger returned. Instead, the herald's first transport was met with fire as it descended through the storm-choked sky. What followed was not a siege, but rather an annihilation. Macro-bombers emerged from the clouds like shadows of judgment. Seismic charges shattered the mountain's defenses, and the rocks split. The air shook. And through the broken flanks of the peak came the Imperial Heralds, grey-armored giants moving with relentless precision and pace. As they advanced, covering the Thunder Siege tank, bolters roared, flames hissed. Every tunnel, every cavern district would all be methodically cleared. Within 3 standard hours, Auric had been reduced to a single holdout, the central cavern. The remaining citizens, now stripped of their gods and defenders, huddled in silence, waiting for something that could not come. But they would not have to wait long. From the shattered ceilings came the Ashen Circle, burning as meteors in their descent, their arrival marked by red fire and screaming stone. These specialists from the Word-Bearers were not warriors in a traditional sense. They were executioners, tasked with a complete erasure of faith. They made no speeches. They made no offers of clemency. The last of the Auric people burned as their idols shattered under blade and flame alike. When it was over, the 17th did not simply leave. They made certain Auric could never rise again. Geothermal reactors buried deep beneath the mountains were detonated as lava surged through the hollowed halls. Stone gods carved by generations were consumed as caverns collapsed and fire burst from the mountain's flanks. Auric died, not with a final cry, but in silence, choked by smoke, ash, and magma. No monuments were erected, no records were preserved, but the message was unmistakable. Across Terra and beyond, those who still clung to the beliefs of the old faith received their warning. To worship false gods was to invite ruin. To resist unity was to vanish from existence. The irony is not lost on anyone that this was the original intended purpose of the Word-Bearers, as they would eventually become the antithesis to this stated purpose. Later, during the Great Crusade, the Word-Bearers, at the time known as the Imperial Heralds, waged a war with a singular focus. To them, conquest was never enough. Conversion was a true measure of victory. Wherever they marched, ancient texts, idols, and relics of alien or human faith were thrown into great pyres, consumed alongside the ruins of the defeated. Yet amidst this destruction, they built monolithic cathedrals and towering monuments dedicated not to reason or science, but to the worship of the Emperor himself. Chaplains of the Legion, handpicked by Lorgar Aurelian, did more than offer counsel to their brothers. They were the architects of the belief system itself, crafting sermons and devotional texts that painted the Emperor not as a mere leader, but as a living god. In every compliance campaign, the pattern repeated itself. A world would be conquered, its faith burned away, and in their place, the god Emperor was enthroned in the hearts of its people. Their progress was slow, methodical, to the point that it almost appeared non-existence by comparison to the other legions. But where others left only submission, the Word-Bearers left belief. Fully loyal, fully converted worlds. Lorgar's reshaping of the 17th Legion was neither swift nor simple either. Even before the reunion with their Primarch, the Imperial Heralds were one of the larger legions, a force of disciplined and ruthless warriors. But Lorgar was not a commander who sought only obedience. He sought to transform the soul. Through patient oratory and zeal from his own chaplains, the faith in the emperor's divinity began as merely whispers amongst the ranks, and he bolstered it into a creed, the chaplaincy, a role adopted by all legions following the Council of Nicaea, acted as both spiritual guides and enforcers to this ever-evolving doctrine. Within the legion structure, new fraternities arose, seemingly similar to the warrior lodges that would later be instituted across many a legion. But in truth, these served as vessels for Lorgar's faith. This careful reformation echoes the methods Lorgar would later use to corrupt entire legions during the Horus Heresy. It may seem paradoxical that warriors who had once burned idols could themselves embrace worship, but this was the nature of the fanatic. The need for purpose, transcended purpose, burned in their cores, and when rationality failed to satisfy, faith took its place. A second factor, subtle yet profound, fueled the transformation: the crusade itself. As the Great Crusade expanded, the 17th Legion was constantly reforged through attrition. New recruits, sons of Colchis, and later countless worlds began to outnumber the Terran-born iconoclasts, who had first marched under the Imperial Truth. These warriors, raised on worlds steeped in belief, found Lorgar's faith not strange but rather natural. When the last of the old iconoclasts had fallen, and every last battle brother believed, Lorgar sealed his work. He shed the Legion's old name, the Imperial Heralds, and he rechristened them as the Word Bearers. To the Imperium, this name spoke of their duty to spread the Imperial Truth. However, to Lorgar, it was a final step in the transformation that he had always intended, to make his legion bearers of faith. Much like his legion, Lorgar Aurelian was unlike any of his brothers. Where they were instruments of war, Lorgar was an architect of creed. To him, religion was not a weakness, but the highest expression of the human soul. He believed utterly that the Emperor of mankind was indeed divine. But this conviction set him on the path that ran counter to the very foundation of the Imperium. The Imperial Truth, cold, unyielding, atheistic, and utterly inflexible, demanded the destruction of superstition. Lorgar, however, sought to build a new faith upon its ashes. He was not respected by his brothers, as Fulgrim and Guilliman, along with others, saw him as the runt of the Emperor's chosen, less a warrior than a preacher, a soul too reflective for the harsh necessities of conquest. While other legions left burning trails across the stars, the word bearers would linger, raising temples as often as they raised fortresses. With the Great Crusade reaching its peak, the contradiction at the heart of Lorgar's nature became undeniable. Worlds that were brought into compliance and stripped of their alien gods and sorceries, and yet left completely empty with their cultures having been hollowed out, had no need for the Emperor's rational truth. However, Lorgar offered them something more. He offered them worship. On conquered worlds, chaplains and mortal preachers fanned the flames of belief, as Lorgar himself delivered sermons so powerful that millions converted by his voice alone. Where once temples had stood, now greater monuments to the God Emperor had risen, their foundations laid upon the bones of those who had refused. These worlds thrived, but unknowingly they had been doomed. The piety Lorgar instilled would one day draw them into the shadow of chaos. Faith, carefully sown, would one day deliver the very weapon that would shatter the Imperium's foundations. It started with whispers, not in the echoing halls of the Imperial Palace, but in outer sectors along war fronts where battle-weary regiments and expeditionary fleets overlapped with the 17th Legion. At first, no one gave the talk any weight. Every legion had its quirks, its cults of personality, its strange battlefield customs, but the stories surrounding the word-bearer were unusually different. Rumors circulated that the sons of Lorgar did not simply fight, they worshipped. Accounts emerged from attached Imperial Army officers and Mechanicum observers who spoke, always off the record, of rituals held in shadowed ruins, sermons delivered amidst the corpses of the vanquished, words spread of ornate symbols carved into stones of reconstructed temples built not after the war but during. Some began to wonder out loud. Had the once famed iconoclasts, the persecutors of all false belief, now embraced the practices they once erased? Had faith, long forbidden under strict codes from the Imperial Truth, taken root once more in their hearts? The scale of the Great Crusade made confirming such speculations all but impossible. It was a campaign of staggering breadth, where fleets were measured in the thousands and armies in the millions upon millions, all scattered across the stars and held together by only fragile threads of warp communication and astropathic relays. The Emperor, seated on Terra, and his war council did not possess the reach to scrutinize every decision made at the galactic frontier. There were too many fires, too many fights, too many enemies to crush for the distant behavior of one legion to command immediate and absolute attention. And so the word-bearers continued, seeing this lack of a challenge as permission. But faith, unlike war, leaves its own arithmetic not just upon the soul, but upon the mind as well. While other legions brought entire sectors under compliance, the word-bearers returned with reports of only a few worlds claimed. Despite deployments of equal size and strength, numbers didn't lie. Discrepancies were small at first, then notable, then impossible to ignore. As the decades passed, high command within the Crusade central bureaucracy finally took notice, as the War Council flooded in with logistical concerns and discrepancies about allocation reports. The authorities authorized a series of quiet inspections, dispatched not as accusations, but under the premises of logistical review. Small expeditions were sent into a cluster of recently subsumed sectors brought into compliance by the 17th. Their task was straightforward: determine if the delays were the result of unexpected resistance, logistical constraints, or something more troubling. What they discovered required no further interpretation. There had been no excessive resistance, no prolonged sieges, no disastrous incidents or Xenos incursions to delay the word-bearers. The slow pace of conquest had one cause: they were choosing to remain. Instead of advancing in haste, the word-bearers' legion lingered after victory. They stayed behind to remake societies, not merely in infrastructure, but in belief. They burned the temples of old religions and replaced them with great basilicas devoted to a singular purpose. Cities were rebuilt, not around industry or governance, but around worship. And that worship bore only one name: the Emperor of Mankind. Not as a leader, not as a man, but as a god. Entire worlds were being reshaped, socially and spiritually, in defiance of the Imperial Truth. This was not the work of a rogue commander or isolated chaplains. It was the Legion's directive, Lorgar's will. The word-bearers were not merely warriors. They were missionaries. They converted as they conquered. By the time Terra took formal notice, the damage was already done. What remains is unclear. Even now, after millennia of study, it is still debated amongst the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordos Chronos alike, whether the Emperor knew or not. Did he turn a blind eye in favor of continued expansion? Did he believe that Lorgar's passion would self-correct? Or did he perhaps underestimate just how deeply belief can take root once it is allowed to bloom? Whatever the answer, the silence from Terra spoke volumes, as the word-bearers were allowed to march on, their temples growing taller, their sermons louder, and all the while, in the shadows of freshly conquered worlds, the first fires of something older and darker and far, far more dangerous began to flicker back to life. This was because no one, and I mean no one, was watching. As the 31st millennium approached its violent crescendo, two seemingly separate events would ignite a chain of consequences that would echo across the Imperium into damnation itself. The first was in the year 903 M30, when a world designated as 4710, known to its people as Kur, was brought into compliance by the Word-Bearers Legion. At their urging, the people of Kur raised a monument to devotion, a city known as Monarchia, a veritable, marvelous mountain of gleaming spires and sacred symmetry. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, declared it as the perfect city, a living shrine and testament to the Emperor of Mankind. But this display of worship would sow the seeds of destruction everlasting. Just over half a century later, in 957 M30, the Imperium would discover a planet glittering with the remnants of humanity's once forgotten golden age. Melikji, a beacon of civilization at the galaxy's trailing edge. Star docks ringed its moons, and cities of steel and glass shimmered under the stars. Yet beneath this utopia lay a horrifying secret. The world was not ruled by men. but by parasites, ancient alien entities, described by eyewitnesses as clouds of black crystal when glimpsed outside of their host. And they had enslaved the entirety of the human population, as they possessed no bodies of their own, instead choosing to inhabit human hosts known only as the Ascended. These parasitic overlords did not rule with terror, but with ritual, with engineered devotion. The Ascended, wearing human faces and bodies, had cultivated a society to sustain their species. They ruled not with open tyranny, but through willing subjugation. When the Imperium scouts arrived, the people of Belgique fought to remain enslaved. Initial efforts to liberate the world had failed, as Grand Marshal of the Expeditionary Fleet, recognizing that conventional conquest would not suffice, sent an astropathic plea for reinforcements. What he received was more than assistance, it was a reckoning, as in full force, Lorgar Aurelian arrived with 8 full chapter equivalents of word-bearers. Upon hearing of the first-hand accounts from liberated captives, he gave a singular command: light the first fire. The Castigator, a war barge of the 17th Legion, entered the system without power and cloaked in silence, slowly drifting behind the world's sphere of orbital defenses. It launched a volley of Nova-class Melta-tipped torpedoes towards the Ascended's orbital cities. These structures, 9 in total, hovered just above the planet's surface, and were home to these parasites, who seemingly feared their own cattle. When the Castigator truly revealed itself, Magic's fleet responded in full, only to be swept aside in a battle that lasted less than an hour. Then came the drop. 5,000 word-bearers, 100,000 Imperial Army auxiliaries, and a litany of others fell upon the world, and they struck the surface in unison. The ground war was immediate and apocalyptic. Within the first hours, millions upon millions were dead. Still, the people of Magic resisted, and as they fought, the Ascended screamed across the planet's communication networks, issuing orders and summoning followers, begging for reinforcements. Lorgar made no effort to silence them until the moment was right. Assault companies breached the orbital cities, punching through the heavy turrets and adamantium shielding. Their goal was not conquest, it was complete and total annihilation. One by one, reactors were sabotaged. One by one, voices fell silent, as a chain of fire ringed the skies. In an instant, the Ascended were no more. On the surface, their former thralls stood in the smoking ruins of rebellion, staring skyward in silence. Most surrendered immediately. The rest would not last a week. 10 years later, Magic sung hymns to the Emperor, but 50 years on, these same voices would whisper darker prayers. In 007 M31, half of Magic's sons and daughters would stand beneath the banner of the word-bearers once again, this time not as liberated servants, but as cultists, chanting the names of alien gods at the gates of Ultramarch itself. But the seeds of the world's fate were planted, not only in fire, but thanks to humiliation. As 7 years after Magic's salvation in 964 M30, the Emperor himself ordered the destruction of Monarchia, the perfect city, once a monument of faith, now obliterated, but not by alien hands. No, by the Ultramarines Legion. This was not war, it was a demonstration, a humiliation, and the Emperor's message was direct. Faith has no place in the Imperium, and the raising of Monarchia was to be a calculated act to castigate Lorgar and remind all the legions of the Imperial Truth, a doctrine of secular unity. But tearing down Monarchia led the Emperor to do something unintended, as he tore open Lorgar's very heart. Crushed by shame, abandoned by the very god that he had worshipped, Lorgar turned his gaze elsewhere, towards beings he believed were more worthy of devotion. And Magic? It would not be the last world to burn in his name. In the long and storied records of the Great Crusade, 2 events separated by legacy and decades stood as grim milestones in the 17th Legion's most infamous legacy. These moments were recorded without embellishment, as they were not tales of glory, but testaments to the severity of belief when weaponized by those ordained to spread the truth through annihilation. The first was a compliance of 4710, and the second, which we will go into further detail now, was the castigation of Lorgar. During the early stages of the Great Crusade, The loyalty Lorgar Aurelian and his 17th Legion, known to the Imperium as word-bearers, was not merely accepted, it was seen as exemplary. The worlds that they had brought into compliance delivered their tithes faithfully in the name of the Emperor of Mankind. Orders from Terra were received and executed without hesitation, and through it all the word-bearers offered not just war and conquest, but devoted subjects that would last for decades unchallenged. For nearly a century, Lorgar prosecuted the Great Crusade with a sacred intensity, building not just an empire, but a faith, a religion, a creed, as his legion crafted monuments, composed litanies, and forged the beliefs that the emperor himself was not merely a ruler, but a god incarnate. And for a span of time, the emperor remained silent upon these actions, as no reprimand came and no rebuke was issued, but rather it was silent, a silence that would not last. As the crusade reached its zenith, the emperor's patience frayed. Though he had once tolerated his son's seal, he came to view it now as a hindrance. The slow pace of compliance on the worlds touched by the word-bearers had become an irritation. Lorgar was not merely conquering, he was taking undue time in converting people. The emperor could not create an imperium to enshrine belief. His vision was that of secular unity and scientific pursuit. The very Imperial Truth was a cornerstone of what he believed humanity should aspire to, not blind worship. The actions of the 17th Legion, including the execution of non-believers, summoned grim echoes of humanity's destructive religious histories, and once these whispers grew loud enough to reach the Golden Throne, action became inevitable. The precise sequence of events remains muddled, as some records diverge. Some sources suggest the Emperor confronted Lorgar personally before acting, warning him, perhaps, that persistence would lead to consequences. Others simply imply that he waited and dispatched agents to investigate, to verify, to understand the extent of the devotion. Whatever the truth, what we know for certain is, the Emperor acted with deliberation. To deliver his reprimand, the Emperor called upon one of his most loyal of sons, Raboot Guilliman, Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, known for order, discipline, and an unwavering loyalty to the Imperial Truth. Raboot Guilliman, Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, known for their discipline and an unwavering loyalty to the Imperial Truth. Guilliman was not chosen at random. He was a living contrast to all things that Lorgar represented, a pragmatist to a preacher, a builder of empires to one who would raise cathedrals. No transcript survives of their direct meeting. Nevertheless, it is known that Guilliman would not speak of it, but soon after he led his legion, 100,000 strong, to a place that would be forever scarred in the minds of the faithful. That place was Kur, officially known as 4710. Kur had once been brought into imperial compliance nearly a century earlier. Its capital, Monarchia, had grown under the guidance of the word-bearers into a city of unmatched beauty and spiritual fervor. A perfect city built in worship to the Emperor of Mankind, who they viewed as a divine being. Cathedrals pierced the skies, hymns constantly echoed from carved stone, and belief was etched into their very architecture, and then it would be destroyed on the direct orders of the Emperor of Mankind. The Ultramarines raised Monarchia, not as a symbolic act, but rather in a surgical strike, a total and complete obliteration. And then when the fires cooled, Lorgar's entire legion was summoned. There on the ashes of the city, they were made to kneel, not in prayer, but in shame, as the Emperor appeared before them, accompanied by Malcador the Sigillite, and the golden host of the eternal failures known as the Legio Custodes. In that moment, he psychically forced them all, Lorgar included, to bow down upon the ground. His words were unambiguous. They had failed him. He was no god, and he would not suffer such belief spread in his name. Then he left. The devastation he left behind was not just a city, but a soul, as Lorgar had been humiliated and shattered, leaving him to withdraw deeper and deeper still into a bitter melancholy, as seeds had been planted in that very moment, ones that would grow into darkness and bear poisoned fruit. This was the raising of Monarchia, and it occurred in 964 M30, being the fact that it was a decisive blow, not against an enemy, but one against a brother. And in hindsight, it was not a lesson properly delivered, but rather an open wound that would be left to fester. Some say the heresy to come was born here, not in rebellion, but rather in heartbreak. And heartbreak, as history has shown us time and time again, makes for a dangerous faith. Following the raising of Monarchia, the path for the 17th Legion splits like a blade. One edge forged for public scrutiny, and the other hidden deep within the shadows. The first tale is the one that the Imperium believed, a narrative of redemption, a legion scorned yet seemingly reborn, emerging from disgrace to resume the Great Crusade with a newfound zeal. This record is inscribed within Imperial archives, show the story of a Primarch corrected, of a son who learned from his father's censure. But the true story, the one hidden beneath this veneer of obedience, is far more disturbing. In the immediate wake of Monarchia's destruction, Lorgar's response appeared to be retreat. His legion all but vanished from the wider theater of war. To many, this absence suggested remorse, but when the word-bearers returned, they were transformed. No longer did they linger to preach and fortify. Now they advanced with a cold resolve, setting worlds ablaze in rapid succession as civilizations crumbled under the banner of compliance, hoisted atop the very ashes of the worlds they transformed. On the surface, this transformation was lauded. The Emperor himself was said to have directly approved of this shift, perhaps believing his sons had shed his errors. Others too were taken in, believing the Legion's renewed fervor stemmed from penance. However, they would never understand just how wrong they were. The shattering of Monarchia did more than wound Lorgar. It unmoored him, stripped from his faith, and condemned before his son. The Primarch was left in a spiritual void. In that silence, something answered. Not the Emperor, something far, far older. What followed was not a withdrawal, it was a transfiguration. The details of this transformation remain elusive. The trail is faint, but certain names emerged, like rusted keys to a forgotten lock. In particular, Cor Ferron, the zealot surrogate father who raised Lorgar on Colchis, and Erebus, the most hated man in existence, the first chaplain whose role in the unfolding catastrophe that was the heresy would echo for centuries. Both of these men were steeped in the old faith, a system of belief already tainted by the warp's corrupting touch long before the Emperor's light ever reached Colchis. One word, pilgrimage, surfaces over and over and over again in what few fragments the Imperium possesses. But what did it mean? Where did Lorgar go? What did he see? Imperial scholars may only speculate, but what we know is when the word-bearers re-emerged, they no longer served the throne. For more than 40 Terran years, the 17th Legion maintained the illusion of loyalty while laying the foundations of a galaxy-spanning betrayal. How they prepared remains uncertain, but there are signs, evidence hidden within patterns and consequences. Their accelerated conquest likely marked a campaign of expansion, recruitment, and indoctrination. Entire worlds were not merely brought to heel, they were fully converted and seeded with a new creed, a faith rooted in chaos. Dissent, both internal and external, was not tolerated. The last of the Terran-born warriors, the iconoclasts who remembered a different truth, seemingly disappeared, silently purged. During this same period, the machinery of the Imperium itself began to rot. Agents, administrators, and even fellow warriors, some corrupted, others deceived, so that when Horus finally fell, the dam of loyalty cracked. And when the dam of loyalty cracked, Lorgar's foundations would already be in place. All I ever wanted was the truth. Quote from Lorgar Aurelian's First Canticle of Chaos. This haunting confession, taken from the Book of Lorgar, opens the records of what is now known as the Pilgrimage of Lorgar, a spiritual odyssey that began around 964 M30, and it was the Primarch's journey, hidden beneath the ancient beliefs of any truth, or if the Emperor's doctrine of reason and atheism was absolute. Lorgar would eventually find his answer, as he discovered the warp gods were in fact real, that the Emperor had all but lied, and that if humanity must worship any power, it could only be them. Thus began his great work, not of conquest, but of conversion. Over the next 4 decades, Lorgar traveled, recruited, and deceived, laying the groundwork for what would become the Horus Heresy. And it would not begin with a sword, but rather with a question, and the truth that answered back. In the events that followed the destruction of Monarchia, even though they remained veiled in obscurity, it has been generally pieced together by Imperial scholars, bold enough to probe through forbidden and potentially heretical sources. After his rebuke, Lorgar withdrew into seclusion aboard his flagship, the Fidelitas Lex. There he granted audience only to the two of his most trusted, Corferon and the disgusting first chaplain Erebus. Corferon, Lorgar's adopted father, and the ruler of Colchis who raised him within a zealous covenant, had been a lifelong advisor and chief lieutenant to the Primarch. Alongside Erebus, he shared a dangerous sympathy for Lorgar's unfulfilled religious longings. Both men harbored secrets, a knowledge of ancient dark gods and a faith in them, entities venerated by the old faith of Colchis, long whispered but hidden from imperial sight. Through their counsel, Lorgar learned of the gods of chaos, beings who not only welcomed his fervent worship, but demanded it. These revelations planted the first seeds of the coming Horus heresy deep within the Wordbearers. Compelled by this newfound knowledge, Lorgar insisted the Legion seek out these deities. Corferon and Erebus, clandestine devotees of chaos for decades, proposed what would become known as the pilgrimage. The concept of a pilgrimage, an ancient quest to reach a sacred place where mortals might commune with gods, was a mystic trope across countless human worlds, including Colchis, as this was not a mere metaphor, as the warp, the Imperium itself, was that place that they would head to. It was a domain of powerful metaphysical entities, the Chaos Gods, who dominated the unseen currents of reality. Prompted by his advisors, Lorgar led the Wordbearers' serrated sun chapter on a journey to the fringes of what is known as Imperial space, as part of the 1301st Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade. Though not yet fully corrupted, Lorgar had ceased to revere the Emperor as a god. Instead, he rejected the Emperor's atheistic Imperial Truth and sought to confirm the existence of deities worthy of human worship. To conceal this quest, the Wordbearers rejoined the Great Crusade with apparent loyalty. Yet they were closely watched, as 5 members of the Legio Custodes were assigned to the Emperor to oversee their actions, ensuring that they did not fall back into error. The fleet of Master Astartes soon reported of unusual voices emerging from the warp near the Cadia system, close to what would later become the infamous Eye of Terror, the galaxy's largest warp storm and a rift in reality. These voices spoke directly to Lorgar, and were the whispered commands of chaos entities. At Cadia, the fleet made orbit, preparing to land on an uncharted planet designated as 1301-12. The landing force combined Imperial Army, Wordbearers, and Custodes alongside Legio Cybernetica elements. What they found shocked even the hardened warriors of the Custodes, barbaric human tribes clad in rags and wielding crude flint spears, yet unflinching in the face of these invaders. Most striking was the tribesmen's violet eyes, mirroring the eerie hue of the Eye of Terror itself. Despite the Custodians' Vendrotha's urgent plea to exterminate these heathens, Lorgar instead insisted on taking a peaceful route. From the gathered crowd emerged a strange woman, a chaos priestess named Inthegal. She addressed Lorgar by name, welcoming him to Cadia, and she would become the architect of his spiritual downfall. Her influence deepened when she transformed into the demon prince Inthegal the Ascended, Vader of the Primordial Truth, guiding the 1301's scout vessel known as Orpheus Lament into the Eye of Terror proper. Within the Eye, the Wordbearers witnessed the remnants of the Eldari Empire, shattered, barren worlds known as Crone Worlds. Inthegal spun a twisted tale of the birth of the Chaos God Slaanesh, claiming the Eldari's fall came from their failure to embrace the primordial truth, the worship of chaos. She asserted that when Slaanesh awoke, her chosen people abandoned her in fear and ignorance, giving birth to the ceaseless storms of the Eye of Terror, echoes of her birth screams. This dark revelation was the very crucible in which the Wordbearers' faith was forged. Inthegal warned that humanity must not repeat the Eldari's fatal errors. Instead, they must accept the worship of the Ruinous Powers if they ever hope to survive. The surviving serrated sun Marines returned to Cadia and recounted their ordeal soon after the Primarch himself ventured into the Eye of Terror, where the Chaos Gods revealed the terrible truth to him and chose him to become their champion. Following this, Lorgar ordered the cyclonic bombardment and annihilation of the native, leaving the planet desolate and guarding the secrets of the primordial truth, along with the Legion's allegiance shifting to chaos. Yet Cadia's strategic importance could not be ignored indefinitely. In the 32nd millennium, Imperial colonists resettled the world. Curiously, the new Cadians also developed the violet eyes of their ancient predecessors, a subtle echo of the planet's dark past. This profound transformation irrevocably changed Lorgar and the Wordbearers, as they would become the first legion to openly worship the Ruinous Powers and to betray the Emperor in their hearts. Over the remaining years of the Great Crusade, they sought to enlighten humanity to the true nature of creation. Deception and manipulation became their tools as they worked to sway at least 9 other Primarchs to chaos, most notably the War Master Horus himself. When it became clear that humanity could only be enlightened through devastation and war, Lorgar took part in orchestrating the Battle of Isstvan III alongside the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V. Ultimately, the galaxy-wide cataclysm known as the Horus Heresy would occur. And so, the many worlds conquered under their shadowed banner had been proven to be corrupted and having been seeded with fanatical cults worshipping the Chaos Gods. And they would provide millions of Chaos devotees in rebellion and the Dark Ages to come, testament to the Wordbearers' enduring legacy of betrayal.